It was supposed to be one of those perfect mornings at my cabin, the kind where the sunlight filters lazily through the trees. The air carries a crisp scent of pine, and the only sound is the occasional bird call echoing through the woods. Had my coffee mug in hand, feet propped on the porch railing, ready to enjoy a day with no interruptions. At least, that was the plan. My peace didn't last long, because out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the unmistakable sight of a white SUV creeping slowly along the gravel road that runs past my property. It wasn't unusual for curious drivers to slow down in the area after all. Cabins dotting the woods have a way of attracting attention, but this wasn't idle sightseeing. The SUV drove past once, then turned around and came by again, slowing, almost to a crawl as the driver leaned forward over the wheel. By the third pass, I knew exactly who it was. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of our local HOA. Now, Karen had a reputation that stretched further than the neighborhood itself. She was the kind of person who considered herself the guardian of order, a woman who believed strongly that her clipboard held the power of law. She'd fine people for leaving trash cans out 10 minutes past pickup time, issued warnings about mailbox paint not matching community standards, and even complained once that a neighbor's wind chimes were audibly offensive. In short, she thrived on conflict and wielded her self-assigned authority like a badge. It wasn't technically even under her HOA's jurisdiction. My cabin sat just outside their boundary lines. But that minor detail never seemed to stop her from meddling. When Karen parked her SUV and stepped out, I knew she was on a mission. She clutched her clipboard in one hand, her phone in the other, marching across my yard like she was storming a fortress. Without so much as a knock on the door or a good morning, she began pacing along my property line, squinting at the ground, muttering about community rights. She jabbed her pen toward my fire pit as though it were a crime scene, scribbling furiously. I set my coffee down and leaned forward, half amused and half irritated, curious to see how far she'd take this little performance. Then came the moment I should have expected, but still found ridiculous. Karen whipped out her phone and started dialing. Her voice, shrill and authoritative, carried across the yard as she announced to the dispatcher that she needed officers sent immediately to survey public land that had been illegally claimed. I nearly spit my coffee out. Public land? Property was privately purchased, clearly fenced, and marked with a boundary line that even a child could recognize. Yet here was Karen, so confident in her imaginary jurisdiction that she was summoning the police to back her up. About 20 minutes later, 2 patrol cars rolled up, their tires crunching against the gravel. The officers stepped out, looking around with polite but unmistakable confusion. I greeted them with a calm wave and invited them onto the porch. While Karen stormed toward them like she'd just discovered a criminal empire, she launched into a tirade about how my yard encroached on public property, how the community needed access, and how I was violating local land use agreements. The officers exchanged glances, trying their best to keep straight faces. One of them finally asked Karen to point out the supposed public land, and she gestured wildly at my fenced yard, my fire pit, and even my woodpile stacked neatly by the shed. The officers inspected the property markers, listened patiently, and then turned back to Karen with a very measured tone. They explained that everything she pointed to was clearly private property, legally owned, and entirely outside her HOA's jurisdiction. In fact, they reminded her she had no authority whatsoever here. I watched as her face reddened, her grip tightening on the clipboard like it was the last piece of power she had left. She sputtered protests, but the officers weren't interested. One of them gave me an apologetic shrug, wished me a good day, and told Karen in no uncertain terms to stop wasting their time with unfounded calls as they drove away. I couldn't help but smile. Karen, however, stood rooted in place, furious and defeated, but still scribbling something on her clipboard, as though writing enough notes would somehow rewrite reality. I sipped my coffee again, savoring the small victory. It was clear that this battle was over, but knowing Karen, the war was far from done. Asterisk, asterisk. After the police left, most people would have taken the hint. Any rational person, confronted with two uniformed officers telling them they were wrong, would have gone home, shaken off the embarrassment, and maybe even reconsidered their need to meddle in other people's business. But Karen was not most people. Instead of leaving my yard, she paced the grass like a hawk searching for prey, still muttering to herself, still clutching that clipboard like it was a weapon. She kept peering at my fence, tapping her pen on the boundary markers. In every few minutes, she'd glance at me sitting comfortably on the porch, as if my calm demeanor only fueled her fury. I'll admit, part of me was annoyed, but a bigger part of me found the whole spectacle hilarious. She looked like a dethroned monarch, trying desperately to reclaim her lost kingdom. Scribbling notes that would never matter, clinging to authority that didn't exist. I considered going inside and ignoring her, but then a mischievous thought crossed my mind. Karen had dragged in the local police, wasted their time, and tried to paint me as some kind of squatter on my own land. Maybe it was time to raise the stakes just a little. So, with a grin, I pulled out my phone and made a call. You see, a good friend of mine happens to serve in a nearby law enforcement agency, a tactical unit. They're running weekend drills just a few miles away. When he answered, I explained the situation with just enough humor to keep it light, how an overzealous HOA warrior had called the cops on my cabin, how she refused to leave, and how she was still prowling my yard like she was on patrol. My friend laughed, promised to swing by, told me to sit tight. About 20 minutes later, before I even heard them, I felt them deep. A mistakable rumble of heavy engines rolling down the gravel road. Karen froze mid-scribble, looking up in confusion as two dark tactical vehicles pulled into view. The sight was something straight out of an action movie. Armored trucks, officers in full gear stepping out with precision, their presence commanding instant attention. To me, it was just my buddy and his team taking a detour for a laugh. Karen, it might as well have been the end of the world. Her face drained of color faster than I thought humanly possible. The clipboard nearly slipped from her hands as she took a nervous step back. One officer, helmet under his arm, calm and professional, approached, scanning the area before speaking. Ma'am, he said evenly, you're on private property. You need to leave immediately. There was no room for debate in his tone. Karen stammered, pointing toward me as though I were the culprit. But her words faltered under the weight of those unblinking eyes. This is public, she tried, but the officer cut her off with a raised hand. No, it's not. Step off the property. The silence that followed was golden. For once, Karen didn't have a retort. She clutched her clipboard to her chest like a shield, nodded stiffly, and shuffled toward her SUV without another word. Every step she took looked like it weighed 100 pounds. When she finally slammed her door and sped off down the road, the only sound left was the hum of the tactical vehicles idling. One of the officers turned to me with a grin. Quite a fan club you've got here, I chuckled, raising my coffee. Mug in salute, you know how it is. Some people just can't handle private property. The team laughed, exchanged a few jokes, then climbed back into their vehicles, leaving the woods as quiet as they had been that morning. I settled back into my chair, savoring the return of peace. The birds were still singing, the sun was still warm, and the only thing out of place now was the faint tire marks from Karen's hasty retreat. I knew she'd probably be back someday. People like her rarely give up completely, but for now, the battlefield was mine, and I couldn't help but smile at the thought that in the clash between Karen's clipboard and my coffee mug, The coffee had won every time.